I mean, if I can switch for a second back to this question of intervention and the administration's view of it as it's evolved, really since Rwanda and since the sort of we mustn't be taken just sitting by in the future. It always seemed to me that there was a very strong feeling in the Clinton administration of regret after Rwanda and of we must take this to heart, but that it got applied to Kosovo, it got applied to thinking about East Timor, it got applied to a lot of places, but not to Africa, because the compelling national interests and the compelling strategic interests and it always comes down to some sort of notion that, oh, this is just humanitarian. It's not a mixture of humanitarian and political. There's not a strategic interest. So you saw Darfur, and we stood at the edges of it. We did a little bit, but there was not going to be that. We saw Congo in a terrible crisis for most of the last decade. We were very hands-off about that. And I've always wondered whether, I mean, we saw Liberia. Now, this was obviously not during the during a democratic administration, but it seems...
Nor was Darfur.
No, it wasn't, but there wasn't a completely clear call one way or the other. And I'm not saying that, by the way, that I say that there should be, but I'm trying to understand what the thinking is and how it's looked at. That there seems to be this very strong kind of notion that we mustn't let these things happen, but when they do, they are complicated, and we are overextended, and they don't imperil us for the most part. And so what is our interest when we see great suffering in a protracted war in Congo? Which is going on certainly throughout the last decade.
Well, you ended with Congo, but you started with the broader picture,
yeah.
and I think
so
it's important to understand that from the U.S. point of view. And I think, let me say, while I can't speak for administrations that I didn't serve in, I do think there's a fair degree of continuity in policy over the last 20-plus years on a bipartisan basis when it comes to Africa. And I think from a U.S. point of view in Africa, our interests are not purely humanitarian. That's a piece of it, an important piece, but they're strategic, they're economic, they're very much from a security vantage point, which is manifest in places ranging from Mali today to Somalia yesterday and today to various other parts of East, West Africa and indeed the Sahel region. So it is not as simple as, humanitarian or nothing. It's all of the above. Our trade and investment relationship with Africa is significant and growing. It is actually a major source of oil and other resources for the United States, but it is also a long-term potential market for trade and investment with the United States. So it's viewed through all of those prisms simultaneously. But I think what has happened in Africa, to an extent that frankly we haven't seen in the Middle East and indeed in other regions of the world, is that the countries of the continent have come together through their own mechanisms, most recently through the establishment of the African Union, but through sub-regional entities, what we know as ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States in the West, the IGAD countries is the East African collection of countries in the Horn, and they have taken leadership responsibility for dealing with these crises and conflicts by deploying forces. And then they have sought from the United States and the United Nations and other Western countries the financial and logistical and sometimes intelligence support to enable those operations. That's what's happened in Somalia with rather substantial success. That's what's begun in Mali in combination with the French. In Cote d'Ivoire, where we had a genuine humanitarian intervention and the restoration of democracy under UN auspices, it was principally an African-led force, but a blue-helmeted UN force. In Congo, the UN has a large peacekeeping presence that has not been as effective as one would want or hope. But again, the leadership there, as we've just seen in resolving the latest round of violence and insurgency in eastern Congo, has come as much from the countries in the neighborhood, backed up by the United Nations, as it has from outside. So what our African partners are seeking and increasingly demanding is not externally imposed solutions or external interventions, but support for their efforts to stabilize and counter security threats, whether it's threats as in Somalia, which are extremist threats, or as in Mali, or whether they're protection of civilians challenges, as in Darfur, where, as you know, it was the African Union that first deployed forces to protect civilians, followed by the United Nations, which actually has had a more salutary impact.
There's also, obviously, and I mean, you're right, absolutely right to say one shouldn't be talking about it in an aggregate as Africa, but in these specific situations. But there is also this coming together, as you describe. And I'm wondering about the American policy, to the extent that it's articulated, sort of what are we looking for in Africa? And you have President Obama go and gives his speech in Ghana. Democracy, democracy. And that's been very much the talking point that I've heard over and over during the last 4 or 5 years from Johnny Carson, the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. And yet, in significant places in Africa, that's not, it doesn't exist in the way that one would like to see it. And yet there can be development without democracy. There are leaders who have very mixed records on human rights and very strong records on development, like Paul Kagame in Rwanda, like in Ethiopia with Isaias. And now you have a situation... Melis, excuse me.
That's a big
exactly. That would. And you also have now a situation where you have the United States sort of looking at the Kenya election and saying, you know, democracy, very, 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 very important to us, but there are consequences to the choices that you make. We sent a very strong message discouraging them from electing the person who was indicted by the ICC or under indictment from the ICC as a suspect. And it seems like if we had any influence, it might have been, if anything, to help him get elected by getting their backup, by getting his supporters' backup. And I wonder how you feel that message really is getting conveyed, how much we have influence in sort of pushing democratization rather than assisting or watching what's happening, why we find ourselves siding with the ICC, a court that we don't subscribe to, and then look hypocritical for saying you must submit to it, though we don't. How do those decisions get made?
There's a lot of stuff in there. Yeah. First of all, our interests in Africa are multiple.
Right.
Yes, we have an interest, as we do everywhere in the world, in promoting and sustaining democracy and respect for human rights. That is a bedrock element of our approach, not just to Africa, but to every other part of the world, from Middle East to Asia to Latin America and elsewhere. But it's not the sum total of our interest or our objective. We very much seek economic development, and through economic development, the lifting of living standards, which is why the United States under President Obama has had such an active and significant investment in food security and agriculture and livelihoods in Africa. We have an interest in the health and well-being of the African people, their education and their physical well-being, which is why the president has built on the initiative that President Bush started with respect to AIDS in Africa, known as PEPFAR, but built it into a global health initiative that goes beyond treatment of a single disease, while including that, but building health infrastructure and capacity in Africa to deal with long-standing health challenges. So we have a multifaceted interest and approach. It's not simply democracy, as important as that is, not simply human rights, as important as that is. It's also economic development. It's also peace and security. And we have counterterrorism interests and concerns. We have, as I mentioned earlier, economic interests and concerns, and thus the promotion of trade and investment between the United States and Africa that benefits both sides of the Atlantic. So all of these are interests that we have to promote and balance simultaneously, which is what makes policymaking both interesting and difficult, because sometimes these are in conflict. And you mentioned some significant examples. You mentioned Rwanda. Rwanda is a case where, as you've written so eloquently, almost 20 years, 19 years after the genocide, Rwanda is a place which is, by many standards, an economic development model. And yet it is not democratic. It's got a bad human rights record and a record of political insularity, and it's been unhelpfully and negatively involved in Congo and elsewhere in the region. So there are pluses and minuses. Yet, on the other hand, Rwanda has been a net positive contributor to UN peacekeeping. It's doing more to prevent atrocities in Darfur than arguably any other country. So it's complicated, and we have to balance both our interest in their security and development with our grave concerns about their lack of democratization and human rights violations. You looked at Kenya. First of all, I want to take a little bit of exception to your characterization of our policy. I think the best articulation of U.S. policy was, in fact, President Obama's video message to the Kenyan people, in which he very clearly said, we respect the will of the Kenyan people, and we've reiterated that over recent days as they have made their choice, at least thus far at the polls. We've stressed the importance of them conducting the elections peacefully without the violence of the last round, and so far, knock on wood, that's happened. Right. And we've also said that to the extent that there are questions and issues and challenges, that they ought to be done in a legal fashion through the established legal processes. The United States has a very long history of friendship and partnership with Kenya, going back to their independence in 1963. And we have every interest in seeing that sustained. And we do have to respect the will of the Kenyan people as they make their choice, provided it was that their choice has been legitimately reflected in the outcome.
Because, I mean, that question obviously comes up not just there, but one saw it also in Egypt when you have, but even there you have a more complicated one, which is a professedly anti-democratic candidate being democratically elected, and us trying to position ourselves. And
by the way, that's not only a challenge in sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. We've seen that in some other parts of the world.